Thank you for tuning in to the Logic of God podcast. I'm Cody.
I'm Gina.
And I'm Ben.
If you're returning, thank you for coming back. And if you are a new guest, welcome.
We are moving on from the story of Adam and Eve, as well as just our little offshoot for Christmas.
A brief dalliance into the time of Christmas.
Yes, and if it is pagan or not. And now we're going to talk about Noah. Noah is one of those stories that mirrors the creation story. It is confusing for Christians. It's something that is hotly debated among atheists. And there's a lot of just miscommunication, misinformation, lazy theology in the story of Noah. So we're going to dive in. We're going to attack it. We're going to talk about some of the less discussed things. And always, if you hear this episode and have questions or feedback, please connect with us. We would love to hear from you.
So the first question that most Christians have, and people studying the Bible have, in regards to the ark and the flood story, is, did it actually happen? Is it allegorical? Is it history? Even for the people who say it's history, there's the subset of questions. Okay, is it a localized flood, or did it cover the entire earth? I think first we can start with, did the flood actually happen? From a scientific or historical perspective, there are people who are on either sides of this discussion. We have people like William Lane Craig or Dr. Stephen Meyer, who will say that there probably was some kind of flood, but it was localized. I think this is also the position of Dr. Gavin Ortlund. And these are all godly men. They bring up their points, and I would encourage you to look up all of the material from them to hear their positions, because I would never be able to fully represent it, because I happen to disagree with them on this. But even Michael Heiser, in his book, The Unseen, and you guys know how much I love Michael Heiser, but even Heiser says that it's not 100% certain the way that the Bible treats this event, whether or not it's local or global. But for the most part, Christians, whether you're old earth or new earth, you do treat this event as it happened. It's not allegorical. It's not meant to be taken as something that is poetic or whatever. At this point, most Christians will say we've moved on to history. But is it local history or is it global history? For that, I'll be honest, I don't see a lot of very good argumentation as to why it would be local. Most of the discussion as to why it would be local seems to center around the idea that everywhere else where the Bible talks about things being, across the whole earth, there will be an empire that will cover the whole earth, or there will be destruction across the whole earth, or whatever. A lot of the time, it seems like it's talking about local things. Like when it talks about how there's an empire that covers the whole earth, specifically the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire didn't cover the whole earth. And what it's talking about there is, for the whole ancient world, yes, the whole ancient world was more or less ruled by the Persians. And then there's the breaking off, there's the Greek Empire and the prophecy in Daniel. We won't get into that here. But basically, there are multiple points where the Bible talks about something being the whole earth, and it's not. That's just the poetic language that they use to basically say everything that we know. The whole earth as we know it, the ancient Near East, and a bit beyond that. But every territory that we are aware of is going to be covered or conquered or affected. That's not what it's saying here, I would argue. And the reason that I would say that is because there are a lot of things that don't make sense if we take that position. For one, the text talks about how the tops of every mountain on earth was covered. And there's also the part where God gives the rainbow, and he says that this is a sign that he will never again cover the whole earth. If this is a local flood, how local are we talking? Are we talking about it covering literally the entirety of the ancient world? Also, there's the question of how long the flood was and what caused the flood. The flood narrative talks about how the fountains of the deep were broken open and water gushed forth from those. Fountains of the deep implies fountains in the ocean, in the depths of the oceans. If the oceans are flooded to the point where they rise up and cover the land, how is it that only the ancient Near East would have been covered? I don't see any other reasonable way to interpret the fountains of the deep. It's not rain that causes this flood, and it's not rivers overflowing because of some kind of seasonal overflowing of the Nile or whatever. You would think of the Tigris, Euphrates, whatever other rivers there happen to be in the ancient world. That's clearly not what we're talking about.
Agreed. No, it poses lots of issues. And I don't, one way or another, this isn't one that I feel like I need to have a hard stance on. But it does, the regional flood does bring up those questions of, okay, the covenant of God. He's not going to flood, a little region of the earth. That's happened again. Doesn't make sense there. So maybe it's just like will not flood an X amount with, the specific region of land. Okay, maybe, but still doesn't explain God's covenant of the rainbow and the Noah's covenant there that we see, and the time frame. If Noah was on the ark for as long as he was, with the waters stopping, water levels itself out. So if he's there for that length of time and it was just regional, the waters would have receded a lot faster, unless he's in a bathtub. See it. There's some decent arguments for it, but I just don't see it, especially with the other flood myths we see all over the globe.
Yes, that is an excellent point. So we've talked a few times about other ancient Near Eastern narratives and how they line up with the Bible. One major point is the narratives that the ancient cultures had regarding the flood. There's a lot of similarities that these ancient narratives share. And it's important that we recognize that, because it helps us in our own interpretation of the Bible and where we can run astray. Because if we treat these different narratives as myths that developed from the truth, you can see how they lead back to the truth in an odd way. To give an example, the Epic of Gilgamesh, there's a point where Gilgamesh is speaking to the epic's version of Noah, and he's asking this guy how it is that he became immortal. And he explains that way back in the ancient past, there was a lot of people, and these people didn't die. They were all immortal. And because nobody ever died on Earth, they were living for thousands and thousands of years. And there was a lot of noise that was going up to heaven, and the gods weren't very pleased, so they basically killed everybody with a flood. But they reached out to this dude, who was their version of Noah. Again, I can't remember this guy's name. And he builds basically a coracle, and he puts a whole bunch of animals on there, and then there's the flood, and it kills off everybody, and he's left behind. And because he's righteous, and because he obeys the gods, he's given immortality. And he lives for a very long time. So, again, you can see where a lot of those details line up with the flood story. And there are individual elements that don't make a lot of sense if you take some of the liberties that modern interpretations do with the story. When you look at the long ages of life that people lived, Adam lived for over 900 years. Noah lived for close to 900 years total, if you add up the time before and after the flood. People were living for hundreds and hundreds of years. You can see how that would be twisted into people living forever, or people living for tens of thousands of years. However, if everyone was living for 80 years at most, and all of these numbers of years that people are living is meant to be taken hyperbolically or metaphorically or rhetorically or poetically or theoretically or any other fancy way, then it really doesn't make a lot of sense. How would all of that be twisted? At what point do you twist people living the normal human lifespan to tens of thousands of years? There's also the question of the flooding of the whole earth. All of these different flood narratives in the past, there's pretty much every culture has a version of the flood that has the whole earth involved. Why is it always the whole earth? And why would the truth be? In that case, you can see how the truth would be. It's not the exaggeration. It's localized. But still, you're taking all of these details together, the long lives, and in some instances, the sins of the world, because the Greeks did actually believe that it's because of human evil that the flood happened, not because of a bunch of noise. The similarities you can see tracing back to this base story that the Bible presents, and you can see how the true details lead to the lie. And so that's the real reason why I like looking at these deviations, these ancient retellings of the story, because you can see how the original details are present there, and you can walk those back to a more accurate representation and more accurate interpretation of what the Bible says.
I think it's interesting too, like we talked about in our episode about Christian or Christmas being pagan. The ancient Near East celebrations at wintertime was all to celebrate the overcoming of chaos, which is the chaos waters, like what we've talked about in our Genesis discussion, which is also an element of Noah's story, is this chaos water, the new creation that happens in the Noah and Ark story. So I don't know, for me, it's an additional layer of confirmation of the Bible's accuracy, just knowing what they were celebrating and what they were talking about culturally. Cody, you got anything else on the ancient Near East flood stories?
No, I wish I knew more about. I know there's a relatively popular one out of China somewhere that I wish I knew more about. But
I can tell you the full list of all of the flood stories.
Oh, go for it.
So there's ancient Mesopotamian flood stories. There's the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is Sumerian. Then there's the Atrahasis epic, which is Akkadian. Then there's a Sumerian king list, which talks about a great flood that separates kings from the rulers. Interesting. There's the Hebrew and Christian flood story in Genesis. There's Greek, which is Deucalion and Pyrrha, which is Zeus sends a flood to destroy humankind, and Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha survive by constructing a chest or boat. There's an Indian one called Manu and the fish. Manu is warned by a fish about a coming flood and is instructed to build a boat saving seeds and life forms. There's a Chinese flood myth, which is Gunyu flood. Describes a flood that lasted years, controlled through heroism and engineering efforts of Yu the Great. There are two Native American flood stories, which is that the earth is flooded due to corruption and animals help recreate the land. And then the Hopi flood story is a global flood occurs as a punishment and only the faithful escape on reed rafts. Mesoamerican, there's an Aztec flood myth. There's Pacific flood stories that are from Maori and Hawaii, African flood stories, Norse, and Australian Aboriginal flood stories.
Pretty much everybody has flood stories.
And it specifically is the whole earth being flooded.
Mm-hmm. There is a little bit of overlap there, though. My understanding is that the Akkadian flood story is the same one that ends up in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The trouble with using the Epic of Gilgamesh is that there have actually been multiple versions of it told throughout history, and we only have the most recent version that's the most complete version, and we can tell that it's been touched up over time. And it's believed, from my understanding, this is something that Wes Huff has talked about, so please check his material out because he's much more knowledgeable about that than any of us is. But he's pointed out that the Akkadian flood story is probably the one that it ends up being inside the Epic of Gilgamesh. But still, the Epic of Gilgamesh does mention it, so it's worth bringing up.
Yeah. We see mankind in the history of the world repeating this story across every single civilization. And it's global because you see Aztec, Australia and New Zealand, China. You see every single continent featured with its own floods, like version of the flood story.
So then there's probably something to it.
Yeah, I would say.
Yeah, so like the popular ones, like all of the ancient Near East ones are the ones that are brought up the most and studied the most. So everybody's always, oh yeah, regional makes sense then. But when you start throwing in these other continents that have eerily similar parallels to the story of Noah and the flood, it's okay, this seems more global rather than just transmission of a story and not being completely cohesive with the Noah story, but also definitely having their own embellishments to them or differences.
Yeah, cultural things like I don't want to use the wrong word because I want to be respectful. For the Native American flood stories, reed rafts, that's something that was familiar to them that they would have made. Whereas Norse, it's a chest. Whereas Roman and Greek, it's something else. It's culturally applicable because they made it apply to where they were at and what they knew. But that doesn't change the fact that it's a worldwide flood that killed all of the people except the people who survived. And they survived because of a raft or a boat of some kind.
Now, there are skeptics who will say, yeah, but floods happen everywhere. You should expect some kind of flood story to happen everywhere. No, I wouldn't say that at all. I think that's silly. I think it's silly to say that every single culture across the world develops a flood story because floods happen in different places. One, why would they consider it to be global? In the Bible, it talks about these waters covering up every mountain. Like, the explanations that I've heard from the secular side are the Nile overflows pretty cyclically, so that's probably where it came from. Are you insane? These people see the Nile overflow and flood things, and they think, okay, then there clearly at one point in the very, very ancient past was a massive flood that covered the whole earth up to over the mountaintops.
There are a lot of people who believe when you say ancient civilizations, they believe making a wheel and building a fire was magnificently miraculous for them. I can see why culturally people don't buy it, but it's wrong.
Yeah, we say it all the time. You know, a lot of people have the presupposition that all ancient civilizations were just stupid. And I don't know why.
It falls within that point that I was trying to make on the outline of making Bible stories cute or child friendly, where you get just the bare minimum. They don't really teach about it on Sunday, and you pick it up in your children's Bible class in school or whatever when you're little, and then you never really learn about it again. And so you think, okay, whatever, dude built a boat, cool. But the reality is the entire world died. A man built an enormous, intricate boat, housed a ton of animals. There is a risk of under analyzing Bible stories. And this is one of the ones that's critical that you understand, because it's a huge argument for atheists. People don't like when God is called a mass murderer. So making these generalizations about different cultures, oh, they're stupid, and oh, God's cruel, and you make these generalizations and then you don't understand the great picture that God is painting here.
Yeah, so this is one that you mentioned touches on one of our core assumptions or presuppositions of God being all loving and good. And that's usually the main argument of the flood story, is that what kind of God would destroy the entire world in one sitting? This is not just bad guys. They're really bad. And this is women, children. Everybody in this story dies except for Noah and his family. So you can't sugarcoat it. And I think that's a hang up for a lot of believers and non-believers alike.
You either are in the camp of, yeah, it happened, and it's a Bible story, whatever. I'm a Christian. It's great. I love God and I believe his word and I trust him and I have faith. Or you have the people who are how is that, if God is the same every single day of forever, then how does that align with what I know to be true about God?
Yes, this is something I hear in the form of a question for pretty much every video I've ever seen on Dr. William Lane Craig's open discussions or QAs that he has, or Turek's, or Ravi Zacharias back in the day. Pretty much every single person who ever had open QAs has been asked, okay, but why the flood? It always comes up in some form or another, but it's always sometimes it's Christians, sometimes it's skeptics, sometimes it's atheists who think that they're going to catch them off guard by asking this question they've been asked a million times. But to be fair, it's a question that's constantly answered a variety of different ways, and it's very rarely satisfying. And how can it be satisfying? Because the truth is that if we believe that God killed everyone on earth, then God killed everyone on earth. How do you justify that? From a modern perspective, it is tough to justify. And that's why I can understand, not just from a historical perspective, but from a moral perspective, why some people take the position of it wasn't a global flood. It was a local flood because the people locally were really bad. It doesn't actually address the issue, which is that innocent people would be caught up in this too. But there are enough explanations here. Again, none of them are fully satisfying, but I think it's best to explore them. And we can even go into one that Gina and Cody have been exploring, which is unique that I haven't heard before, but I think it's definitely worth covering here. So there's the Frank Turek explanation that death is just moving people from one place to another place. God, in the act of covering the earth in a flood, just moved a whole bunch of people from earth to heaven or to hell. And William Lane Craig makes a similar argument that, the righteous end up with God in heaven, the kids would be innocent, they'd end up with God in heaven, and all the bad people would end up in hell. Okay, sure. The problem with that explanation is that when Jesus goes to Lazarus, he's going to raise him up in 5 seconds. But the most famous short verse that everyone has memorized, Jesus wept. He weeps with Lazarus's family.
And this doesn't, not just a tear rolled down inside. This is like ugly snot booger weeping. Like this is weeping, not just. It's
not Jesus shed a single tear.
Yeah.
No, it's not a dramatic, beautiful, cool cry like we would all hope we have. No, it is an undignified image of Jesus. That's what it's supposed to be. Because death is the ultimate violation of life. And if Jesus wept for his friend, who he was going to bring back in like 30 seconds, why is it that he would enable such destruction on such a massive scale? That everyone minus a handful of people on a boat would die off. And horribly, too. Like, drowning is a fear that a lot of people have. It's a hard way to go. It's a bad way to go.
Yeah.
If you've ever been like to the beach and it's a little choppier than you're comfortable with, but you go out in the water anyway, and there's that little bit of panic. What if it sucks me out? That happened to the whole world.
Yeah, it did suck them out, though.
What do you mean?
It sucked them out and down and never to return.
I know.
Again.
That's what I'm saying. Like that little fear in your heart when you're like in the water and it's a little bit iffy. It's relatable to this story.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so you have that. And honestly, that to me is a very Calvinistic response. When you hear like John MacArthur or R.C. Sproul ask this question, they chuckle and say, God's sovereign. That's almost what Frank and William Lane Craig do in their response, and it's highly unsatisfactory. And I don't think it's honest with Scripture or what they're trying to convey with what they're doing. Like their purpose of them being there at those discussions undermines them when they answer questions. So is there other responses you wanted to cover?
Yeah, there's also his response, which is a much less common one, but is more common the farther back you go. And it's that a significant amount of the earth was actually corrupted by the angels having children with humans and creating the Nephilim. Contextually, this actually does make sense, and I think it does actually help, though it's, again, not fully satisfying. The reason that it helps is that, again, contextually, the story of the flood precedes the Bible talking about how angels had children with the daughters of men because they found them beautiful and created the Nephilim. And this is an unholy creation. The Book of Enoch explores this. We've talked about this to death at this point, so no reason to go too deep into it. It's enough to say that basically the Bible at this point is talking about how angels were corrupting God's creation. And Enoch talks about how it's not just humans, but it's also nature. They twist it and corrupt it. They create different kinds of animals that actively hunt and destroy and don't seem to have any good use. The wasp that lays eggs in a caterpillar while it's still alive. Things that it seems like God would never make, and that sin in the world, it wouldn't seem like just people being mean to each other would cause to happen. Now, the angels did that. The angels, as an act of rebellion, did this to God's creation and also to the people made in his image. And so by the time of the flood, there were a lot of Nephilim about, a lot of half-breeds between angels and humans. And so God looks at that and says, I have to wipe it out or else there will be no coming back, because he lets it get to the point where it's just one man and his family. And he says, if I let this continue, there will be nothing left. So I have to destroy and start over. That does make sense. However, it's still not fully satisfying, in my opinion. The reason is because it doesn't seem like that's what the Bible is stressing either. This is something the Bible discusses slightly prior to the flood. However, it talks about him being grieved at making man, not Nephilim. The Nephilim are involved in this, to be sure. But the impetus for the flood is what God says is man's evil. So while Nephilim and angels and all that, the corruption of creation definitely is a part of it, man ultimately is the reason God says he has to do it. Why that? And I think you guys actually do have a good explanation that builds on this that I think is pretty satisfying.
Yeah, this does continue on with, I haven't heard Heiser talk about that, but the idea that the corruption was so bad and not necessarily man's fault, but man is still going to have to be judged for that. And it goes into verse, I believe, 6.
Chapter 6, verse 6?
Yeah, chapter 6, verse 6 talks about God regretted mankind, making mankind, right? Let me pull up the verse, actually. Yeah. So verse 6 in chapter 6. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the word regretted there stuck out to me, and I'm still in the infancy of researching this, but that word that's used or translated regretted there is not translated as regretted anywhere else in the Torah. So the first 5 books of the Bible, this author uses this word multiple times in Scripture, but in the Torah, but it is only translated regretted once. Usually it's translated as consoled or comforted or grieved. So to me, it fits with what we read contextually about the Nephilim and this being a result of their rebellion corrupting humankind so far that God almost needed to have this mercy kill. So there's a lot to this not being an accurate translation up front to me. I'm not a biblical Hebrew scholar. I can't speak to that, but it seems awfully weird in context of this being regret. A whole lot of thoughts come to mind thinking God regrets something, but also not being used that way anywhere else in the Torah from this author, from the author of the first 5 books, which we believe is Moses, anywhere else. So usually when authors, this goes back to like hermeneutical approaches, when authors use a word and use it multiple times in one way, it's odd when they start using it in a different way.
What's also interesting is you have mentioned that it is used that way in Samuel as well. That's the first time in the future that it's used that way. What's interesting about that is I'm pretty sure you're talking about when God says that he regrets making Saul king, right? What's weird about that is that Samuel is speaking to Saul about this at one point, and he says God does not regret. So we are simultaneously told in the same book, both that God regretted making Saul king, but also that God does not regret things. Inherently, the Bible treats God's regret as different from normal regret, even if we want to treat this as regret. I agree with you, Cody. The usage of it as regret is odd, especially as it pertains to God himself. No matter what, it is treating it differently. So the question is, how should we treat it?
Yeah, and this is where it plays off the story or the way that some early church fathers and the Heiser interpretation you went through from the watcher's perspective or the Nephilim coming down. But as a mercy kill, you also see this pop up in the New Testament. So the story of the people who have fallen during the flood, Jesus ends up going and preaching to, which is very peculiar.
So where do you get that from?
1 Peter 3:18. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey, when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. Peter specifically calls back to the time of Noah and the people who didn't believe in the time of Noah. And Jesus, after he makes his sacrifice for us, going to proclaim to the spirits in prison.
Yeah, and I think that's a pretty clear instance. When you couple that with, in 2 Peter, it talks about the gospel being preached to those who are now dead. If you tie those two together, it seems pretty clear that Peter believes that Jesus did die once for all, meaning for the people past, present, and future.
This answers a question that we often get asked from people who don't believe, which is, how do you explain like salvation for people who lived before Jesus's time? How could a loving God create many generations of people for the purpose of destruction and not save them? And it's a misunderstanding of the text.
And it's not just in 1st and 2nd Peter where this is talked about. The Apostles' Creed specifically says that Jesus went down into hell and he rose again on the third day. In Revelation, it talks about how Jesus has the keys of death and of Hades. And it's also referenced both in the Old and New Testament, the verse in the Psalms about how you will not abandon your Holy One to Sheol. You will not let your Holy One see decay. We generally, in English Bibles, interpret that verse in Psalms as death, but basically saying death twice. You will not abandon your Holy One to the grave. It's actually talking about Sheol is the name of the realm of the dead. You will not abandon your servant to the realm of the dead.
Go listen to our episodes on heaven and hell to understand what we're talking about.
Also, Sheol's very important. None of you have listened to that still. We know that you don't listen to it. But Sheol was very central to the understanding of Christians and Jews at the time of the Old Testament and the New Testament. This is where Jesus went. Why did he go there? He went there to proclaim the good news even to those who were beyond all hope of being reached. So if there was anyone during the time of the flood who could have been reached, God spared nothing, including his own son, to reach those people. This isn't just a story about destruction, it's a story of redemption. And what's especially beautiful about this is the names of the patriarchs from Adam to Noah, to tie all of that together.
Yeah, so basically what's going on here is that God compassionately acknowledged that it would be impossible for man to overcome the issues being caused by these hybrid creatures and the sin that came with it and the power and authority that came with it. And he killed them in mercy, knowing Christ was going to eventually restore them to eternity. So like our relationship with death needs to change in order for us to accept that this is a good thing that God did.
And it still aligns with God being merciful, yes, but also enacting judgment in that time as well. Similar position to when all the firstborns of Egypt are also brutally killed. Yeah, so you see similarities in these stories of God still enacts judgment. He's a just God, but there's also a mercy aspect to it as well.
Real quick, I had mentioned the names from Adam to Noah. If you interpret the names of the men from Adam to Noah, there's Adam, Seth, Enosh, Canaan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, and Noah. When you interpret those names and put them into a sentence, what you get is man is appointed mortal. In his dwelling, earth, the praise of God came down to make disciples, was pierced by a man who is unknown to give rest to mankind.
That is the gospel in the first generations of our world.
God gave us the gospel message in the names of the men from Adam to Noah. And I don't think that's a coincidence. And I think he's telling us in those names exactly what happens to those people. That yes, judgment ultimately happens, and judgment and destruction needed to happen. But hope for them wasn't gone. And you may still have issues with the flood. I understand that. It is rough. It is harsh. The flood was a harsh event.
But he was taking away their future here for a possibility of a future somewhere else. There were people who were beyond redemption that died during the flood. We know that the world was in such a state of disarray and chaos and sin that it was necessary for everyone to die. So we have to accept that a lot of those people probably were not saved, but we also know that Jesus...
I think this is definitely a more modern Western problem, because I think people who have experienced some evil, have witnessed true evil in this world, have less of a problem dealing with this verse. It's the people who haven't witnessed how depraved humanity can really get at its worst. And that still exists today. There's complete... I don't know how to say this without being more than PG, but there's terrible things that happen in our world that we just don't acknowledge or play down. Truly horrific things. Look into human trafficking, for one. Not just the idea of human trafficking, but what goes on with the people who are trafficked.
Or even like fast fashion slave labor. The people who make your favorite brands. Like the little kids who sew together your clothing.
There is a sense of evil that the world can get to that I think most people would agree that it needed to be wiped out. And if we take the Bible for what it's saying, and that depravity has reached all of mankind and its entire every thought, then you can see how this would be necessary.
And going back to what you were talking about before, Cody, about the use of the Hebrew word being translated to he regretted. The word here is vayinahem. It can be translated generally as either he was comforted or he regretted. Those seem to be the two main interpretations. But either direction, it's a very gentle word. It's not meant to be a harsh or angry word. And the word that's followed up in Genesis chapter 6, verse 6, that talks about how he was saddened, it's vayitatsev. And it's also a very gentle word. It's he was sad. These are words that are meant to convey the feelings that God felt before he destroys the earth. He's not angry. He's not happy about killing all of these people. And there's a very similar picture that we get at Nineveh when God sends Jonah in, and the compassion that he feels towards the Ninevites, the people who he says don't know their left arm from their right. He has compassion for these people as well. The problem is that he also knows the future. He has let things get to this point because of our free will, our ability to choose, and we've chosen wrong. And because of the gravity of our decisions, both humans and angels, we screw things up to the point where there's only a handful of righteous people left. And again, from other stories that we see in the Bible, from Sodom and Gomorrah, if I find 10 righteous souls in the city, I will spare it. God literally goes in person to Sodom and Gomorrah to see if there's anybody there, any reason not to destroy the cities. There aren't. He gets the people who are righteous and gets them to leave. He does this personally, and everyone else is destroyed. Now, still, there are people who look at this story and they say, God is all powerful. He definitely could have done something. But yes, he could have simply said the words, everyone on earth is now righteous. He could have obliterated every ounce of sin in every single person, if we believe that God is not a God of order. Because we believe God is a God of order, we can't actually allow for that possibility. If God is a God of order, there are things he either can't or, if you like, will not do. If God wants us to make choices, he can't simply speak and undo them. If he wants his creations to choose him, it has to be of their own free will. And Cody and I had talked about this in a previous episode. What I see in the overarching story of the Bible is God repeatedly showing again and again why he is the one who ultimately has to rule and why we have to surrender our authority and surrender our will to him. In this first age of humanity, or really technically the second age, the very first age is where there's no temptation really. The only temptation is outside, not inside. We don't have a sinful nature. The serpent comes in and tempts us and we choose wrong. Now we have humanity all over the place, and God lets his angels rule as well. Everything has free will. We choose wrong. We choose to corrupt ourselves and God's creation, and it grieves him, and he destroys it, wipes it out, starts all over. Now there's more structure, but we still choose things other than him. We choose angels as humans to worship rather than him.
We see one of the people who was included on the ark then goes and sins.
Oh, yes. And that's probably something worth covering here, too. Because that's another question that people have that they struggle a lot with.
Real quick, on what you brought up Nineveh and what people think, like they see this evil God almost. A lot of atheists refuse to believe this because he just killed all these people. There's nothing he could have done. And people all the time say the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament are so much different. There's no mercy in the Old Testament. It's all mercy in the New Testament. But with the story of Nineveh, that is proof that God is not willing to wipe people out until the time is ready. He sends Jonah, they repent, those people are saved, and then not till later does Nineveh get wiped out. Similar thought pattern with the Amorites. And when Abraham, or end of the 12 tribes, the story of Joseph, that the Amorites' full sin is not to completion yet. It's not going to be complete till another 400 years. So he's not wiping them out until later on. It is, and then the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's not until it's come to complete and utter depravity that he is willing to take matters into his own hands and remove that.
And when you look at like where we are today, 2,000 years after Jesus walked on this earth, how are we any different? Yeah, okay, so the people who died during Noah's time have to wait until Jesus raptures everybody or something. Okay, so do we. Like, we're living 2,000 years after the fact. We have to wait too. So it's a moot argument to me to be upset that God made them wait, because we are waiting too. All of mankind is waiting in the history of the universe. I don't find that to be a very good argument. Anyway.
Yeah. You have those people who believe we go straight to heaven when we die, which I'm not one of those people, but
yeah.
Go listen to our episodes.
Go listen to our episode on heaven.
So sorry to derail that and go backwards, but yeah, this story of the curse of Canaan.
Yeah, so that's another detail in the flood story that people really struggle with. This story it'll be a little long to read, but it's worth reading in its entirety. So this is immediately after the flood is finished, all the animals have been let off the ark, and Noah is starting to establish his life on the world after everything is starting to recover. So this is Genesis chapter 9, verse 20. Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. He drank the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backward, and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." Okay, the big question there, a couple of big questions. First question is, why exactly is Ham in trouble for walking into his dad's tent while he's asleep and naked and seeing that? And two, even bigger question, why is Ham's son Canaan cursed? Generally, people ask, okay, why was Ham cursed? No, Ham wasn't cursed. Ham's not cursed at all in this thing.
And if Noah was asleep, how did he find out?
Apparently, his brothers told him. But yeah,
or there was a child.
Yeah, so we'll get to that. But the way that it seems to be told in English, and again, this isn't where translations can be a bit of an issue, because technically the translation is not wrong here. But from the way that it reads in English, what it seems like happens is Ham is just walking into his dad's tent, and he sees his dad is naked, and then he runs out to his brothers and says, "Hey, dad's naked in his tent." And then his brothers, "Oh, crud, that's not good." Even though it's his own private tent, so why do you care? And they drape a skin on their backs, and they walk in backwards, and they cover up their dad. And then their dad wakes up, it's like, "Oh boy, I drank a lot of wine. What's going on?" And then they tell him, "Hey, so Ham saw you naked." What? Your son is cursed.
This is the same. I know there's a big time gap here, but like, how is it okay for Moses' wife to throw his foreskin, or his son's foreskin? Like, how is that okay, but it's not okay for Noah's son to see him naked?
Yeah, so there's three interpretations that are common here. One is, oh, Noah just overreacts. It's got Noah overreacting, not God. That's one excuse. There's another one where people believe that Ham performed homosexual acts on his dad, and that's really what was bad, and that's what he told his brothers, but that doesn't really explain why Ham's son was cursed and nothing happened to Ham at all. Then there's the third, which follows the line of, got to jump forward to, I think it's Leviticus, where it talks about what the nakedness is. And the nakedness here in Leviticus is your wife's nakedness is your nakedness. So Gina's nakedness would be my nakedness. My nakedness would be hers. So
because we're one flesh.
Yes.
And that ties back to Adam and Eve.
Yeah. So the connection here is what makes more logical sense to me is Ham saw an opportunity to usurp his father as headship of the clan. You see this all throughout even scripture. David's son tries to do this as well. Sleeping with your clan's lead spouse or anything like that is a way to usurp it and show dominance. So you have this idea that Ham is trying to usurp Noah here. A child was produced from that, and that's why Canaan is cursed rather than any repercussions of Ham.
Yes. In English, we have idioms. We have turns of phrase. If I say to Cody and Gina, hey, do you guys want to meet up for dinner? And they say yes. I say, okay, cool beans. Well, what does the temperature of vegetation have to do with anything? No, cool beans is an expression. We have expressions in modern English, and at the time of the writing of the first 5 books of the Bible, they had idioms as well. You may wonder, okay, if this interpretation is correct, if Ham had sex with his mother, which is what we're talking about, just laying it all out there openly, why doesn't the Bible also openly say that? One, the Bible is using some diplomatic language.
Yeah, you can read the entire book of Song of Solomon and not know what it's talking about. Scriptures are very good at being polite when describing acts between men and women.
Yes, it's talking about, in a very polite way, Ham uncovering his father's nakedness. In some ways, it's trying to show respect to the mother, because what happened is so disgusting and terrible that it's difficult to talk about. It would have been difficult at the time. It's difficult now. This is one way of exploring that. It's possible that's not what it's saying. However, it's the explanation, I think, and I agree with Cody, I think it's the explanation that makes the most logical sense.
Otherwise, it's just some weird kid being weird. This is a power play in a civilization that is being reborn after the entire world died.
You have this idea, too, that I've heard is they viewed the being naked and seeing that way different than we do in this culture. But like cultural context, like when these cultures made covenants, and we'll read later when Abraham's servant goes to make a covenant that he's going to bring back a wife. And the Bible says that he puts it on his inner thigh. That probably is not accurate. He's probably grabbing the reproductive organ of the person he's making a covenant with, because that is what is at stake here. They're making a promise that this is my family on the line here. And so the idea that they're just some prudish culture, that there is, you saw your dad naked. No, that's absolutely, I don't think fits here at all.
No, and when you adjust the story, taking into account that this is likely an idiom, it changes the whole scope of the story. Now, suddenly it's Ham walks into his father's tent. Noah and his mother were both likely drunk at this point. Ham has his way with his mother, while his father is drunk and asleep. And then he goes out and brags to his brothers about it. His brothers are horrified. They don't want to see what happened, and they want to honor their mother. So they put an animal skin on their backs, walking backwards so they don't see what's happened, and they drape it over her to protect her. Then they wake their father and let him know what's happened. Now his father knows what's going on, and he says that his son, the product of this act, is going to be cursed. Now this isn't about retribution against Canaan, his son, because Canaan still has a full life, and the kid had no say in this at all. The reason this curse exists is because Ham had an intention for his son. He wanted to usurp Noah's authority, to suddenly be the patriarch, the head of this family.
This ties in so well with the creation story, with the way that Eve was deceived and power was attempted to be usurped. Like, this aligns so much more in my mind with these repeated themes that we see in the scriptures.
Yeah, so like breaking down the Noah story here, you have the chaos waters that start at the flood, the spirit hovering over the deep in the beginning of Genesis. Then you have order coming in creation in Genesis 1. And then also after Noah emerges from the ark, this is also a new creation that has been purged from sin and shame. So you have all these parallels here. And then it seems this is paralleling also the tree mentality, the usurping of what God's order is, and why this is so detrimental and cause for curse. This is going against the order that God has put forth.
Dang.
Also, alert to every parent who's listening, get your kids out of the room.
Sorry. Yeah, we keep doing that.
Yeah, we really need to start throwing some alerts before we're talking about this heavier stuff.
I'll have to pre-record. Like, this has content not suitable for young minds.
But this is part of the danger of scrubbing the Bible to try to make it all kid-friendly. And I think there are a lot of people who grew up in the church, and because they grew up hearing all these stories, it was all scrubbed and sterilized and made to be kid-friendly. And these stories are meant to be for children, old wives' tales and fairy tales. They're not that.
The Lord told Noah.
Children of the Lord.
And that's good to bring up, because like you see these depictions of Noah and it's just this little ark, and like it makes you lean towards this mythological, this story, just a story, not something that actually happened. And that's where I respect the Ark Museum that Ken Ham. I don't agree with a lot of what Ken Ham says, but respect the Ark exhibit because they do a good job of building it to the specifications that are in the Bible. And there are some creative liberties on how things happen, because we don't exactly know how the ark was set up or designed to house the animals and all of that, but it does a good job of breaking it down where it is feasible or plausible that this could have actually happened.
I mean, we've been there. We've seen it.
Yeah, that's another point. There are people who hear about two of every kind of animal being put on the ark. One, it's not two of every kind of animal. It's 7 pairs of clean animals and then 1 pair of unclean animals. So it's actually more than that. But also, modern people take kind to mean species. And so you'll hear, again, the adamant atheists say, there are millions and millions of species on the earth. And you're telling me that 2 of every one of those was put on the ark. And so like there's no ship in the world that would be big enough for that. No, that's not what the Bible is saying. There are scientists who have actually worked around the idea of what kind means. Even today, we have some vague idea of what the Bible may mean by kind. When we say dog is a wide umbrella that covers a lot of different animals, that covers wolves, that covers domesticated dogs, that covers coyotes, that covers dingoes, that covers a lot of different kinds of canines. But we don't exactly mean canine. We mean something along those lines, but it's a bit different. And there are scientists who've tried to work back onto what the common ancestor for all dogs, all canines is. And there's been a lot of really good work on that. It does seem like exspeciation is a thing. We do get different species that develop from a common ancestor, but there are hard limits to what that can do. You can't get a dog with wings. You can just get a dog that's smaller or taller or faster or shorter legs or longer tail or longer ears or short ears or no ears. You can get all kinds of different variations of a dog, but in the end of the day, it's still a dog. And that seems to be what happened with the ark, or the argument about what happened on the ark, is that in the end, there were maybe only 7,000 kinds of animals on the ark. And they were likely juveniles to save space, so that by the time the ark was done with its purpose, its journey, and it opened it up, one, there would have been a year passing, so most of these animals would have finally reached maturity by that point, if not slightly before that. But Two, it would have saved a lot of space on the ark. You don't have to have these massive dinosaurs. There are people who ask, were dinosaurs on the ark? The answer is probably yes. They just weren't full grown. There's nothing in the Bible that says they were full grown.
No.
But that's speculative. We're not told a whole lot. We're not given the total number of animals on the ark. We're given the size of the ark, and we're told that they went onto the ark 2 by 2, and that 7 pairs of the clean kinds of animals were brought on, and 1 pair of unclean. That's really just about all we're told. But in the end, like you said, Cody, it's plausible. When you see it all laid out, and there are a lot of people who've dedicated their lives, oddly enough, to figuring all of this out. A lot of good work has gone into figuring out if it's plausible. And it is plausible.
Yep.
It's like when you're laying down the foundation of your faith, you can do it a lot of different ways. I think for me, it was more like, what do I know from growing up? And I didn't grow up religious. I went to vacation Bible school, I think twice ever. And I grew up a part-time Catholic. I can tell you a lot about the saints. I can't really tell you a lot about the Bible stories. So I came into Christianity. Yeah, Noah was a thing, and Adam and Eve were a thing. And there's a lot of things, and they existed. And because the pastor said so, and I'm going to just take everything at face value, and I'm not really going to question anything. But the further that I got into my faith, the more that I realized stuff didn't add up to me. It made me uncomfortable. I was angry because I didn't think that explanations made sense, or they didn't align with what I knew to be true about God. So they defied the 5 core assumptions, and I was told, accept it. And I didn't like that. And so that's where these puzzle pieces have laid down, and they've patched up the parts of the foundation of my faith that are weak. Because if I accept that Noah's just a dude who built a boat, and I don't really think about the fact that the entire world died, and I don't really think about what the rest of the Bible talks about when it talks about the flood, and I don't really understand what happened with Ham and Adam, then I miss out on the connections and parallels that help validate the rest of the Bible. And I dumb down the history, like the family history that I have through scripture, through Christianity. Like, God baptized the entire world for a future with Jesus because it was irreparable. And even still, because of Ham and his decision, the world fell all over again. And we continue to fall.
When you view these stories as real, when you really start looking into them, when you start toying with the possibility that this level of destruction really happened, you take it seriously. You look at the world differently. It starts to paint a picture of a world that is scarred. The world that we live in is not the same one that Adam and Eve lived in, or that even Noah lived in prior to the flood, or even the same one that he lived in immediately after the flood. We live in a world that's still recovering from a cataclysmic event that happened thousands of years ago. We have mountaintops that were sheared off of their bases and vibrated 50 miles away. We have mountain ranges that were created from the force of tectonic plates smashing together. We have volcanic activity, the earth itself giving up massive amounts of heat and lava and exploding. We have the ice caps, which pretty much everyone agrees they didn't exist before. Why do they exist now? Well, there was a cold period that developed as a result of all the increased cloud cover. Tons of torrential rain and biomes changing radically. And now we have the deserts, the Gobi, the Sahara. They were at one time very lush and very green and much smaller than they are now. The world is constantly changing, trying to find an equilibrium after this horrible event happened. And because of us, our sins, and the sins of God's other creations, we have a world that's incomplete, that is constantly crying out for justice. The heavens declare, the earth itself, the stones will cry out. The earth longs for justice. It bears the scars of our inaction and our own personal acts of rebellion. When you view the world that way, it makes sense why all of this does have to end, why a new world has to be made.
When you think about the curse of Canaan and what Ham did, it's like really filthy and disgusting to think that a man raped his own mom. But we try to take authority from God all the time. and we're no better. And that's like a horrible thing to say and a horrible thing to think, but we're constantly trying to usurp God and his authority and his sovereignty, and we rob him of his true character, and we spread misinformation because we're not informed ourselves. And I just think it's a reality check for Christians when we reevaluate this story of Noah and what happened before and after the flood.
So what does this have to do with church history? We said we're venturing out into church history, and you're probably asking yourself, what does all of this Genesis talk have to do with the church? The whole point of this is to retrain your mind to read your Bible differently, to listen and hear and be taught differently than what you have been. When people start reading the Bible, they get the general message and the gospel message, and that's great. That's not bad. But what this has to do with church history is we're now grafted in. We are part of the larger branch in Christ, and this is now us as Protestants, our history. Not that we're overtaking it and becoming a new identity and Jewish, but this is our history. This is what God has revealed to us in history. And what better way to learn the character of God, get to know your Creator than the outline that he's provided.
One more thing that it ties into for church history is that in the book of Revelation, we're told about how this all ends. One day the world is destined for fire, for destruction. We're told once that it was already destroyed by water, and that same world, as Paul says, is dedicated for destruction by fire. This is our past, but it's also an indication of our future. And it's also an exploration of why it happens in the future. The same cycle of sin perpetuates itself over and over again. And God is the one who changes the setup. He constantly alters things in very large ways, in significant ways, where it seems like he's taking the initial temptations out or changing things to where we have the best chance, a better chance than we did before. We don't have the Nephilim anymore. We don't have the divine council anymore. God rules the world. He conquered it for us. He gave us the power to go forth and make disciples of all nations. Through the process of sanctification, we can all become more like him. And even with all of that, things are still going to become so terrible that he has to come in and destroy the whole world again. You're right, Gina. We're not any better than the people who inherited the world the first time. If we lived then, we'd probably be making the same mistakes that they did, if not for the grace of God.
We get stuck because we think this is it. We don't understand that we're in the womb right now. We haven't even been born yet. Like, I'm not trying to talk in conspiracy theory riddles. Like, this earth is our womb that we are living in, and we will be born into heaven or hell. That's it. And the decisions that we make while we're in this infant period affect us for eternity. And it's easy because we love our lives to get caught up in what we love, our children, our home, our job, our beauty, our wealth, any number of things. And yet this is all going to burn. This is not eternity. This doesn't come with us. And we might know our spouse and we might know our children. And who knows, maybe we're married in heaven. I don't know. What I do know is my house, my car, my clothes, my beauty, none of it's going to last. And God warns us of that. And yet we try to control here because we ignore there. And it's wrong. It's a mistake. Our relationship with death has to change because it's not the evil thing. The evil thing would be death without salvation. It would be wicked of us to neglect those that we know who don't know Jesus. And it would be wicked of us to pretend like we have our salvation, but not live for eternity. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to our podcast today. If you liked what you heard, please feel free to subscribe and share and leave a positive review. And if you would like to connect with us on social media, you can do so on Instagram and Facebook at The Logic of God. You can also send us an email at main.thelogicofgod@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening. We hope you have a great day.